the cloud. Leave it up there. Hello, welcome everybody. This is James Rush with Korea Tessel, and we welcome you to this session. We have quite a bit of information to sort through that I am not an expert on, but this guy that we have here, Michael, my first time meeting you, I'm excited to hear what you have to say about English for Lingua Franca communication for Korea speakers and beyond. So I will turn it over to you now, sir.
Good morning, James. 안녕하세요, everyone, and a very nice afternoon for you over in Korea, or for those of you who are, as I am, in Europe, a nice, though cloudy morning. So the way we're going to move through is, first I'm going to present the place of the English language in the world across several domains, and subsequently how English is being used by non-native speakers for communication with other non-native speakers. And we're going to finish off with some indications on how we can use the knowledge that research has brought into teaching English to speakers whose first language is Korean. And of course, that context can then be moved and applied to other ones as once you know the method behind it. All right. So, lingua franca, a term that we'll be using over and over, probably familiar to everyone, a bridge, a language between speakers who do not share a common mother tongue. And of course, there have been several languages fulfilling that role in the past across different continents. And now it's English that is the most globally used lingua franca. According to different statistics, it's spoken by around 1/3 of the global population, and the climb of this language is now slightly slowing down. So it's not as quick as it used to be in the past decades. But we're in a situation where non-native users outnumber native speakers by a ratio of at least 4:1. And those predictions and projections are going to look even dimmer for the native speakers out there, so that within 2 and 3 more decades, it may be that only around 5 to 8% of native speakers of the users of the English language in the world are going to be native speakers, and all the rest are going to be non-natives. And this means at least 2 things, or it has at least 2 implications. One is that this language is no longer being shaped exclusively by the native users. For instance, think of all those families where the spouses do not share each other's mother tongue, and they speak to each other in English, but English is not their native tongue, and then they're bringing up their children very often also using English, and that's the English that the child is going to acquire. So the child will be growing up with an English that was not the mother tongue of neither the father or the mother. And the situation also means that for many learners, communication with native speakers may only happen in the classroom, in the language classroom. And then they may leave the school walls and go out and be using the language, but talking to other non-native speakers. So what happens for a lot of the learners today is that they do not necessarily try to copy and emulate what native speakers are doing, but they're trying to adapt and modify their knowledge of English to the circumstances, knowingly or unwittingly. Actually, sometimes the belief that the goal of English language teaching is to turn a learner into a native speaker of that language has been compared to the Spanish waiter paradox. For those of you who are familiar with Faulty Towers, this is Manuel. He's Spanish, as the name suggests, and he's a waiter in a provincial hotel in England. Let's see a short clip here.
You see, I speak English well. I learn it from a book. Hello, I am English. Hello. How are you, sir? I can speak English. Ah, hello, Major. How are you today? I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful day today. Is it? Oh, yes, I suppose it is. Yes, I can speak English. I learned it from a book. Did you? Did you really? Oh, there you are, Faulty.
Yes, I'm just going to open up, Major.
Oh, fine. I say that's a remarkable animal you have there, Faulty. Where did you get it?
Samson's in the town.
Really? Well, was it expensive?
£12, I think.
Good Lord. Japanese, was it?
Canadian, I think, Major.
Yeah, I didn't know the Canadians was clever as that. My God.
He started early.
Right, yeah, so what happens with a lot of learners of English today is that they try to use the language as a communicative device while preserving their identity. And what's taking place in these situations is what happens to any other living language. That is phenomena such as language spread, variation, adaptability. It's just that in the case of English, these are additionally accelerated and intensified by non-native users. Now, why is English the dominant language today? Well, one of the reasons is that it's the language of the companies that dominate in the outsourcing market. So most of those companies are based in the United States or in the UK, and then they typically will want their employees to speak the language of the headquarters rather than the other way around. And this leads to scenarios where you might actually not expect the complications involved. So for instance, you go to a McDonald's and a McDrive, as the one pictured here, and you first place your order through the intercom before you drive up to the window to collect it. Now, what often happens is, if you're, for instance, ordering in the United States, is that you're not necessarily speaking to the person behind the wall. You may be speaking to someone in India who will then transcribe your order and send it back in a text format to the kitchen. It's not faster, it takes a few seconds more, but it's much cheaper because of the labor costs. Now, what happens is that the employees, let's say somewhere around Bangalore, are not asked to speak American English, they are asked to neutralize their Indian accent. English is also the language of communication in companies where there is no native speaking, English native speaking stakeholder capital, so to say. For instance, here you can see the Toyota Peugeot Citroën automobile plant in Kolín in the Czech Republic. So a factory in the Czech Republic that manufactures Japanese and French cars, and the language that is used on the premises to communicate between and among the three different native speaker groups, French, Czech, and Japanese employees, doesn't use those languages, but uses, again, English for communication. Of course, in schools, English had long overtaken other languages as the first foreign language. This took place at the expense of Russian in post-Soviet domination states. but also the expense of French, either in Russia or, for instance, some Swiss cantons. So if you go to Switzerland, you may come across situations and cantons where there will be quite a lot of speakers of German, one of the 4 official languages, and quite a lot of speakers of English, which is not an official language of Switzerland, but not so many necessarily speakers of French, which is an official language of the country, just because some cantons introduce English before French.
Pardon me, Michael, is with that, I think DE is German and ES is Spanish.
Spanish and RU is Russian, exactly, yeah.
Gotcha, thank you.
Welcome. Then entertainment and mass media. Of course, we know that the scene is really dominated by Hollywood productions and other native-speaking ones. But the English language creeps in even where you might not necessarily expect it. For instance, who's that?
No idea.
You might be better placed to answer.
Eurovision winner?
Yeah, a very good Eurovision winner. So that's Conchita Wurst. And no, they were representing Austria. And in Eurovision, the setup is such that every country sends one candidate representing that country. And you might be expecting national languages there. But no, usually either the entire song is going to be in English or at least the refrain, because in the voting system, where you can vote for representatives of other countries, but not your own, of course, you can gain more votes if it's not just the case that the audience likes the tune, but also if they understand. So let's listen to just a fragment of the winning song. Or maybe I didn't, I think I didn't include it here for, because I included something different, something even better. But definitely Conchita Wurst was singing in English. Now, if you look across domains and across situations, and the numbers of people who are able to speak the different languages, then if you just look at the mother tongue, in Europe, English is not number 1 because that place goes to German. But if you add people who are able to communicate in the language on top of native speakers, then we're going to see that at least in Europe, the number of native speakers is twice as high as that of the runner-up. Of course, it's a little, well, it's not the case that every country speaks the language to the same extent. There's quite a bit of variation here, but typically Scandinavia and the Netherlands end up pretty high up, to the extent that in some scenarios there have been voices saying that you might call those countries or the status of English in those countries a second rather than a foreign language. But then there's also another interesting phenomenon here, that is that in the UK and Ireland, you don't have 100% of English speakers. Because, for instance, what's the second most spoken language in the UK after English?
Polish.
Exactly. And that's official numbers. And now you might be you might be a Pole living in the UK, sharing your flat or apartment with other Poles and working for a Polish company and doing your groceries in a Polish store. There's a Polish store in practically every small town and even village in the UK. And you do not necessarily need English to survive. And of course, there are groups in other ethnicities as well that will not necessarily speak the language, especially the older generations. Now, it's a little more difficult to assess numbers globally, but some estimates have been made, and English again ends up in the first place. David Crystal cites even a slightly higher number. And then there's Putonghua close behind. Of course, the difference is that when you speak Chinese, it gives you mileage in a certain geographical region. So China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Singapore, expat diasporas in different cities, but those are like pockets. Whereas the English language is helpful in a lot other areas. So the situation we're in is not entirely new. It began with colonization in the 16th century, but it's primarily in this century that we came to the scenario where the predominant reason for learning the language is to interact with other non-native users. And this is also reflected in the ideas that people have about the English language. For instance, Katja Lochtmann carried out an interesting study at Vrije Universiteit in Brussels, asking students about the connotations and associations they had with different languages. The students would typically have associations. So when they thought of German, they'd think of Ordnung and being organized. In terms of French, they thought of Romanticism. With Russia, they'd maybe think of laissez-faire attitudes and so on and so forth. But they didn't really have visible attitudes and connotations connected with the English language, because to them, the English language was a language that they would be using in classrooms, with fellow students, with tourists, when they themselves were traveling. So it was a tool rather than a cultural artifact. So historically, sometimes maybe in the generations of our parents, if we're non-native speakers, speaking English would be an indicator of social prestige. It would open many doors and land high-paying jobs. And you were typically in the minority. Today, the situation is sort of the reverse. Now, you're in many situations, you're in the minority if you do not speak the language. And the language is being treated more as a generic skill alongside reading, writing, arithmetic, rather than a separate subject in the curriculum. And you can see that in the way it's being taught in more and more contexts, where it's often taught through content and language integrated learning, where you've got a content subject teacher and a language teacher teaching in the same class, and the students are acquiring both linguistic and subject competences at the same time. And also, if you think of the Common European framework of reference for languages and the can-do statements, then at least the original can-do statements didn't refer so much to the notion of native speakers anymore. So we're in a situation where this language is used even in scenarios where it might not be expected. And we're in a situation that was forecasted over 1.5 centuries ago by Grimm, who then said, keine unter allen neueren Sprachen hat eine größere Kraft und Stärke empfangen als die Englische. None of the modern languages received more power than English, and it may fully rightly be called a world language that's particularly well designed to reign in all corners of the world. Grimm had other ideas for why English should be the world language than those that it really became a world language for. But that's where we are now. And we're in a situation where sometimes you might even not expect or want English there. For instance, school exchange trips, whose goal is to make students make friends with their classmates from another country and to use a language that they are learning at school. So you may have a group of German kids going to Italy or Italian kids going to Germany, and then to the frustration of the teachers, they may often be speaking in English rather than Italian and German. And then, of course, in the European Union, English became one of the working languages upon the accession of Austria, Finland, and Sweden, none of them being inner circle countries. Now, of course, the question is, all right, what happens after Brexit in this situation where this post-colonial country is now a sort of, or may feel like maybe an ex-colonial country, because the European Union no longer has a country that has declared English as their national language, because Ireland declared Gaelic, Malta declared Maltese. So now we have a European Union without any country that had declared English as its language. But probably the ship has sailed, so we are probably just left there with the English language. It would be too costly and confusing to do anything other than that. So we're probably more likely in a situation such as this one.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry. Do you speak English?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Oh. My car's broken down, and I wondered if you could tell me where to find a garage.
Well, you know, that's wasted on me. I don't understand what you're saying.
You don't speak any English at all?
Not a word. No. It's one of those things where I wish I paid more attention in school. But excuse me. Sorry. Do you speak any English?
English? No. What's the problem?
I don't know. I can't understand it.
Hi. My car's broken down, and I need to find a garage.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't understand that at all.
All right. Well, thanks.
Tell you what, if you go down that way, about half a mile, there's a village. There might be somebody there that speaks English.
Right. Okay. So the term or label English as a lingua franca or English as an international language, they're often used interchangeably. There is a slight nuance in meaning, and also the term ELF is more frequent in Europe than across the Atlantic, where EIL is probably a little more used a little more often, but they tend to refer to the situation where we have witness use of English among speakers of different mother tongues and language backgrounds. And historically, you would find the label to use and refer to a communication among non-native speakers. Today, researchers agree that English as a lingua franca can emerge also in conversations with a native speaker, as long as the native speaker makes the effort to understand their interlocutor and also tries to make themselves understood. So before we proceed, we might want to integrate a few concepts that often come up in discussions, such as who a native speaker is. And here you might come up with a few criteria: place of birth, accent, and some others that may not immediately come to your mind, for instance, skin color. Often you might come across situations where we see a person who was born in the city of London and then went to Eton and graduated from Oxbridge, but their parents are, say, of African descent. And then someone might be skeptical about that person actually being a native speaker because they don't look like a stereotypical native speaker. Let me illustrate it with Chang Wan Ho. And you tell me what language he's a native speaker of.
Found a funny South Korean. He's here with us tonight. I'm going to introduce you to him. Please put your hands together for Wan Ho Chung. Chung. So, one ho. Thanks for coming out and being our special guest, our special weapon, if you will. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the beautiful people of Dubai?
안녕하세요. 나는 한국 사람이요. 나는 이름 원호 인속 일본 영원청.
I have no idea what he said, but here's what I'd like to do. I'm just going to give you the microphone, and I'd like you to entertain the people of Dubai. Maybe do a song and dance, if you will. Is that okay? Do you guys want to hear One Ho Chung? Want some? Okay. One Ho Chung, everybody. Okay, that's good. You'll be fine. Just go ahead and go. Just go right in the front. Right in the front. One Ho Chung, everybody.
وعدينا يا شو عدينا على بر الهوى رسينا أنا عمري معاك وهوايا هواك عدينا يا شو عدينا. ضحكت عليكم ولا لأ؟ الصدمة اللي انتوا فيها عادي جدا، بتصير معي كل يوم. كل يوم من حياتي ناس بنصدموا انه كيف واحد كوري بيحكي عربي، معقول؟ مرة كنت بالشغل راكب الاليفيتر، فتح الباب، دخلت وقفت، بفوت وراي واحد خليجي، فماشي وبطلع مش عاجبه، يعني انه يا اخي طلع هذا شعره كيف واقف. قلت له مش فاهم يعني حلو ولا مش حلو؟ قال لي لا مرة حلو. على كل for all those who are non-Arabic speakers, I do apologize, but there's a Showtime initiative to launch stand-up comedy in Arabic. Hence my presence on stage. So yeah, big ups. So anyways, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Wan Ho. No joke. I swear. أظن أهلي لما إجوا بدهم يسموني إنه what shall we name him? Wan Ho, because it's funny in the States. It'll make for good comedy. Anyways, my name is Wan Ho. أبوي كوري. أمي فيتنامية. وعشت كل حياتي بالأردن. Yes. Anyone from Jordan? يحيي أصلكو. Anyways, أكيد أنتوا عم تطلعوا علي وعم تحكوا هذا شكله زي مسلسل مدبلج. ماذا تفعلين هنا يا كاساندرا؟ فسختي خطوبتك مع أليخاندرو لتكوني مع هذا زير النساء الفلبيني. على سيرة الكف احكي لكم شوي عن ماما. امي زي ما قلت لكم مرة فيتنامية، كتير فخورة باصلها. She loves the fact that she's Vietnamese and شوي عصبية. فمرة لابسة مريول البيت ولابسة الابرن ولابسة المنديل على راسها وقاعدة بتنظف البيت، عم تطبخ وعم تجلي وكذا. بدق باب البيت، فهي بتروح بتفتح الباب، في واحد من شو تايم جاي ركب ريسيفر، فبتفرج فيها هيك بقول لها هلو مدام بالبيت؟ فماي مام جوز كوكو، she's like انا مدام، انت حمار، انا مدام. anyways ثاني يوم صارت تنظف البيت بعواعي السهرة.
All right, so which language is Chang Wan Ho a native speaker of?
Perhaps many.
Right, so the problem with defining a native speaker arises, or the main problem arises, once you've got more than one language. Because let's assume that we got someone who is being brought up in a binational family, let's say in Korea, and for the first 3 years of life, they're living in Korea and the parents are speaking Korean to the child. And then when the child is 3, they move to an English-speaking country and decide to change the language to English. Is that child a native speaker of, when they grow up, a native speaker of Korean or a native speaker of English? What if they moved when they were 7? What if they moved when they were 12? What if they moved when they were older and the other language became their dominant language? So the only foolproof criterion really for being a native speaker is when you only speak one language. Then another label that is often problematic is that of proper or real or standard English. And again, this is an idealized notion, because if you look at reference descriptions, for instance, Randolph Quirk's A Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, it's more or less this thick, 1889 pages. That's only morphosyntax, right? No exercises, are just morphosyntactic description of the language. Then there will be things that native speakers are not aware of in that book, and then there will be linguistic phenomena used by native speakers that are not included in that reference volume. And here I'm not even venturing into the domain of so-called substandard varieties. But we are dealing with a scenario of double standards, because often what counts as legitimate native varieties and their manifestations is something that learners of English are going to be criticized or penalized for or corrected in the classroom. Now, the reason we're in a situation like this is, of course, that the English language today doesn't have one source, but a number thereof, given the number of countries that speak it. And then within those countries, you come across regional sub-varieties that may often be incomprehensible once you cross an isogloss. So incomprehensible across native speakers. For instance, in my last week's workshop, where we looked at the specificities of the English language used in menus and recipes, I brought up a few examples of differences in the English language of words and expressions that mean different things across the Atlantic. And then there are also discrepancies, for instance, in terms of measures, where if you're translating a recipe, you need to know whether it came from the UK or the US or Canada or Australia, because the same measure or unit of measurement is actually a slightly different capacity or weight. So let's see a few authentic examples of miscommunication. Here's a report on a scenario where an Australian passenger flying to the US from Australia uses one of the most stereotypical or common idioms of the Australian language on the flight, and the flight attendant thinks that that was an offense, so the passenger had to explain her behavior to police officers after the plane landed, even though that was a flight from Australia. Then within the US, of course, many of you may be familiar with this. So the different nodes denoting fizzy or soft carbonated drinks. So here you've got a map of the relative frequencies of the terms pop, Coke, and soda, used to refer generically to a sparkling drink in the US. Here's a report from the UK, where in Brighton, a guy got arrested because he was speaking with a strong Merseyside accent, and the bystanders thought that he was drunk. But you still typically have this feeling that we should go for a model to present to our students. And now in Europe, this used to be received pronunciation. The problem with picking received pronunciation as a model is that today RP is spoken by fewer than 2% of the English population, not even the British population. Fewer than 2% of English women and English men speak RP. So if you choose that as the model, then you might be accused of teaching your students something that does not really exist, right? Even if you look at Elizabeth II's speech, phonetic analysis have shown that her pronunciation has moved away from what was considered upper class standard, more towards upper middle class. In schools, BBC English is no longer the model, nor is it actually for the BBC, where you find various variants of the language. So maybe let's go for the language that is, or of the country that has the highest number of native speakers, and that's going to be the United States today. The problem is that if you look at the map of American English dialects, it looks maybe a bit like a Jackson Pollock painting, and Standard English is by no means the most common variety there. But still, we have to combat the preconception that it's the native speakers that are the owners and as reference points of the English language, and that anything that is different from what native speakers do is an error. The calendar cover here in the corner is from last October when I was guest teaching in Germany, still physically. And you can see how this native speaker norm and ideal still out there. So let me make a brief aside here, because I'm finding this important in classroom practices. So as we said, English as a lingua franca, so ELF or ELF, takes place when two persons meet who do not share a common language. Now, in typical language classrooms, as for instance in Korea, we have a scenario where the students typically do share a common language. So they may all or almost all be speaking Korean, or maybe all or almost all will be speaking Chinese, given the incoming student populations. And then we have to remember to make our tasks really authentic and really realistic, which often gets forgotten. So let me give you an example of a task where the teacher failed to ensure that. Okay, so this task said, you're to assume the role of a Chinese immigrant, writing a letter home describing your experiences. That's, I think, the late 19th century. And yeah, you're expected to write about your experiences and contributions. And the student goes, 我在这里生活得很差, and so on and so forth, right? So I've been living here very poorly, etc. The student does the task. This is the 19th century, you're a Chinese immigrant, you're probably not a Harvard scholar, and even if you were, why would you be using a foreign language to write back to your family, right? So this is an example of a task that was not really realistic for the student. All right, one more label that should be brought up here, because there's often a confusion around this, is that some people think that ELF is a language variety. Now, language variety is an ethnopolitical and sociocultural construct used for and by people that share a common culture and typically reside in a common area. Whereas by definition, English as a lingua franca is used when at least one of the participants has left their speech community, right? So either someone has come over to ours or we have left ours and gone over to another community. So if we want to use a label for the persons who partake in ELF communication, then two that have been proposed have been discourse communities and communities of practice. Community of practice is better here because it refers to a group of people who use, in this case, language for a common goal, whereas discourse communities still tend to emphasize differences and that are specific for different groups. All right, so the aim of ELF interactions is communicative efficiency. That is typically achieved by accommodating to our interlocutor. And this is different from grammatical correctness. So typical trademarks of ELF interactions are added redundancy, over-regularization, use of other languages, repetition, paraphrase. We recurrently see omission of third-person singular S, omission of the ing ending, just one question tag, omission of the plural or pluralizing nouns that tend to be singular, using who and which interchangeably or generically, overuse of the definite article or omission of articles. Now you might at this point be thinking, it's all very well that he's saying, but this is just a handful of typical mistakes that my learners make. Sure, but the difference between these and some others is that when these happen, communication still succeeds. Now, research has also been carried out on what works and what doesn't work in terms of pronunciation. So Jenny Jenkins wrote her influential dissertation by analyzing oral communication among non-native speakers, and seeing where communication broke down due to mispronunciation. And then she came up with the Lingua Franca core, that is a list of items that are crucial in international intelligibility, and those that go outside the core are not problematic. So let's see what she found. Consonants are important apart from the and the, so the interdentals. Which, depending on the context, can be replaced with other sounds. And actually, for instance, if you're from Ireland, or you go to Ireland, you will very often hear, instead of, so if you want to find an antonym for thick, in Ireland, you're going to say it's thin, not it's thin, right? And people will understand. Now, of course, it's not that anything goes.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Yep, so it's not that anything goes, of course, but interdentals are really difficult to most learners because they're pretty infrequent across the world's languages. That's one thing. And another is that in some cultures, it's considered impolite to be seen with your tongue sticking out between your teeth. So learners might be quite anxious doing that and embarrassed. Some other items in the Lingua Franca core, approximations of core sounds are fine. So whether you pronounce a T with the tip of your tongue, on the tip of your teeth, or on the base of your teeth, or on the alveolar ridge, doesn't matter as long as it's obvious that it's a T. Aspiration is important. Clusters. Speaking Polish, we can have 5 consonants one after another without a cluster, without an intervening vowel. You can say, for instance, wstryknąć. There were 5 there, and it's not a problem for us. But many languages only have open syllables, and then it's really difficult for speakers of those languages to use clusters. And then they will often try to simplify by omitting one of the consonants, and then that's not going to work. And let's say I'm going to pick up a stone. So you want to simplify the cluster. I want to pick up a song. I want to pick up a tone. Like what for your mobile? That's not going to work. I'm going to show you what can work instead if we look at the last item, that is epenthesis. So that's basically the insertion of a small or mini vowel to break up the cluster. And then you can say, I'm going to pick up a tone, right? And it's still recoverable. And actually some people do that unconsciously. I remember once after teaching in Japan, I was on a boat ride and we were nearing the end, and then the guy driving the boat said, "Ruto basu stopu." And everyone, of course, understood that he meant root bus stop, right? But by inserting a vowel after the final consonant, he was breaking up those closed syllables into open ones. In terms of vowels, length is important, so that is something that we definitely have to teach. And then in terms of prosody, emphasizing the focal word in the sentence. Outside the core, so things that may take place, but they won't break down communication, are accurate production of interdentals, exact quality of the vowel. Usually when you get the length right, the word will be recoverable. Weak forms for production. If your students are going to be exposed to highly proficient speakers or to native speakers, then you of course cannot expect over 280 million Americans, no, 328 it's now, but not all speak English, or 67 million Britons to stop using weak forms. So the learners will have to be exposed to a sufficient amount of input in that language to be able to understand it. But in production, weak forms are detrimental to communication. And as you've been listening to me, I've been using quite a few of them actually. Epenthesis, I'm Jose, I'm from Spain. Perfect. Word stress and the rhythm, you know, whether you stress the word on the last syllable or the penultimate syllable or the first syllable isn't as important as stressing the right word. And rhythm, if I were you may train that, and you may get the students repeat that in class, and then they will probably forget it once they're out of the class, and then they may acquire it again if they're immersed in society, but it's not the most important out there. And yet, if you think of the time that some teachers expend on those areas, you might think whether that's necessarily the best investment. So very often, actually, these non-native behaviors are more intelligible than native ones. So let's hear an exchange from the Housing Committee of the British Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, I know from speaking to a number of parliamentary colleagues that there are still certain aspects of the estate, including the Northern Estate, that are not great for people with disabilities. Can I ask the Honourable Gentleman what work is being done to make sure that this place is more accessible, particularly for some of our colleagues who have a disability?
Here, here.
I'm sorry, it must be something to do with my Antipodean background. Could you please repeat the question, because I didn't follow it?
Wow.
very popular today. I'm saying that a number of parliamentary colleagues who have disabilities do find it quite difficult getting around certain parts of the state. Given that we're doing this refurbishment work, what can be done to make sure that those with a disability are able to move around more freely and the place is accessible?
I'm really sorry. Please, could you do it very slowly in intimidating English? Thank you.
Just give any old answer.
I think the answer. I think the answer might be helped if you can reply in writing when you read. Right, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try it on the first go.
Oh, no,
can I? Because I'm Welsh, so God help him.
Right, so Lyndon represents Glasgow. Beresford spent much of his life in New Zealand, and he's definitely having a hard time there. And that's how Lyndon commented on the exchange later. And now you, of course, are getting the cultural reference. So let's perhaps see a non-native speaker giving a short speech and how they might actually be a better role model for many students.
I believe that against ignorance, we have education. Against the threats on the planet, science. I believe in building a better future for our children, which requires offering them a planet that is still habitable in 25 years. Some people think that securing current industries and their jobs is more urgent than transforming our economies to meet the global challenge of climate change. I hear these concerns, but we must find a smooth transition to a low-carbon economy. By polluting the oceans, not mitigating CO2 emissions, and destroying our biodiversity, we are killing our planet. Let us face it. There is no planet B. And I'm sure one day the United States will come back and join the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure let me say we have two possible ways ahead. We can choose isolationism, withdrawal, and nationalism. This is an option. It can be tempting to us as a temporary remedy to our fears. But closing the door to the word will not stop the evolution of the word. It will not douse but inflame the fears of our citizens. We have to keep our eyes wide open to the new risks right in front of us. I'm convinced that if we decide to open our eyes wider, we will be stronger. We will overcome the dangers. We will not let the rampaging work of extreme nationalism shake a world full of hopes for greater prosperity. Personally, if you ask me, I do not share the fascination for new strong powers, the abandonment of freedom, and the illusion of nationalism.
Right, so of course you could hear that he was French, and there were probably a couple items from the Lingua Franca core that he might improve on, but definitely Macron or any other successful non-native speaker using English for their communicative purposes might be a more relatable and achievable role model for the students. Now, all this doesn't mean that it's an easier task for the teacher, because there are important competencies that come to the fore and have often been overlooked in the past in classrooms, such as interaction strategies, negotiation for meaning, building rapport, intercultural accommodation skills, and then the so-called small cultures The norms of behavior, for instance, in an international hospital, rather than the culture of, for instance, the UK. Now, I had mentioned before that it's not that anything goes, and in an analysis of the Vienna-Oxford International Corpus of English, when we looked at all the conversations and identified their causes, you can see that the second from the top is wrong word order and tenses, and that accounted for at least 7 cases of communication breakdowns in the corpus. So it's not that we can turn a blind eye to everything. And then we also looked at successful prevention and remedial strategies, and in many cases, actually, the simplest options of repetition, paraphrase, or enhancing explicitness may actually already solve the trick. So ELF is not a sort of bastardized language, as we've seen, because it's not that anything goes. And it shouldn't be confused with attempts of language planning. Some of you may be familiar with, for instance, conlanguages, so artificially constructed languages. Just a few illustrated here on the basis of television and film productions, where the names in gray are the names of linguists who had been employed to devise those languages. And some of them actually can be learned now on Duolingo. And in the case of the English language, there had been attempts in the past to devise sort of a simpler English for international communication. The problem was that in all those cases, this was the work of one guy sitting down and thinking of what they thought would work, rather than actual research. So the implications of ELF are that what's natural and frequent in native speaker discourse may not necessarily be useful to our students, who may not be engaging in that kind of conversations and not in those roles. So samples of actually occurring language are not necessarily good examples to learn from. And authentic had better be redefined as the language that is used by experts, irrespective of whether those experts are or are not native speakers. And here we might bring up one useful notion from the Swiss education system. That's the notion of functional plurilingualism. And that is the recognition that in every multilingual or bilingual person, the different skills in the languages are developed to different extents. And here is an example of a pentalingual speaker, heritage language Croatian, born in Switzerland, and we can see that her listening and conversation skills are strongest in the heritage language and in Swiss German, so the language of the street, the language of the kindergarten. Whereas her strongest language in terms of reading and writing, so academic competences, is Standard German, because it's Hochdeutsch, that's the language of instruction at school, and it's at school that you learn to read and write. And this is at odds with what typically mainstream language exams expect you to demonstrate. IELTS, TOEFL, Cambridge, Trinity, and so forth, where in order to get a certificate that says that you're at B2 level, you have to be at B2 level in terms of reading, writing, listening, speaking, interaction, and mediation. You fail one of the competencies and you don't get your certificate. That's not the reality for most of the language users today. This I may skip to move to conclusions, because I want to showcase something that will be relevant to the Korean context. So I'm not necessarily speaking at this point that, or advocating the use of ill-formed constructions, but we should give our learners a choice between trying to approximate to native-like models and awareness of the situation of English in the world today, and the kind of interlocutors that they will be most likely to interact with. And then we always only have that many hours, contact hours per week. So we necessarily need to cut some corners, and then research on what is crucial for ELF communication can make decisions concerning the selection and the sequencing of material. Then this research may also come helpful in error correction, because we typically don't want to correct everything that might intimidate the learner, but those areas that will really be important and that are at their stage of interlanguage development and that they can actually process. Plus complementing instruction with those skills and strategies that are important to overcome gaps in linguistic competence. Then there are also implications for translation and interpreting, but basically they could be summed up in a nutshell by saying that you want to ensure clarity of the message, and that, for instance, typically means reduction of idiomaticity. All right, so let's now see how we can apply this to a context such as teaching speakers of Korean. So first, I will quickly go through problems that were identified by another researcher among Korean learners of English. I won't be spending a lot of time on the slides because I will want to focus on how we can actually apply what we know about ELF communication. So we can see that there are several problems in phonology, both in terms of the vowel production and consonants. So that's quite a lot of problems already just in terms of vowels and consonants. And then there's a bit on stress and intonation, grammar, problems with verbs, tense and aspect, passives, questions, answers, nouns, pronouns, some that may be more difficult to categorize in some cases, and then there are some lesser issues. Pragmatics, of course, we mustn't forget that. Okay, so that's quite a bit, right? If you think of a teacher who's looking at that list and then realizes that they have to make learners overcome those problems, that's already intimidating. It might be intimidating to the learners if they were to know all those issues that they have to deal with. So let's try to filter that and to make this more digestible and user-friendly to both learners and teachers. So I'll be using different shades of gray, not 50, but a few. And the lighter the hue, the less problematic a given issue is. So in terms of vowels, we can see that there are two areas here that will not typically lead to a communication breakdown. In terms of consonants, there are also two areas. And the others are indeed problematic, so attention does really have to be focused on those. Phonology, all right, this may be not a huge problem, but not a nil problem either. So sounding monotonous or bored or boring may have an effect on the interlocutor, but it's not necessarily that it's an effect that's going to make you misunderstood. It's just that your intentions might be misunderstood. Grammar, and here we can see that actually things are becoming a lot sunnier, so to say, because out of that slide with verb problems, most of them turn out not to be that problematic. Of course, it depends on the exact construction in some cases, but we see a few items that we had seen before as frequent trademarks of ELF communication that do not pose communication barriers. In terms of tense and aspect, again, there's a scale of problematicity here. as there is in the case of, for instance, the passive voice, where the forms will often be reconstructed, even if it's not exactly what you would expect according to the textbook. The word order in embedded questions, the omnipresent inversion in reported questions, that's still understandable. Omission of plural s, we've seen that this is often unproblematic, especially if you've got a numeral or another quantifier that makes sure that this is more than one. Many of the problems with pronouns turn out to be less of an issue, and this slide is almost invisible now. And then punctuation, well, as we had said before, this is really minor. And in terms of pragmatics, of course, the expressions of politeness, these are important. The other items are slightly less so. So, of course, it doesn't mean that all the problems that were listed here and that were identified by the 2002 need necessarily appear across all learner populations. But once we observe some problems, we may decide, all right, so this is something that is really important for international intelligibility. So I need to focus on that and maybe do some focus on forms in my classroom and correct that. And these, I find this irritating or annoying, but everyone will understand that, and there are more important things, so I can turn a blind eye to this. All right, and because I want to leave a little room for questions, I will now finish off by reenacting a conversation that took place between a hotel room guest and room service in a hotel somewhere in Southeast Asia. So you'll see the lines scrolling up, and then once we've seen a few, I'll basically try to reenact it. So it went more or less like this. Money, room service. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I dialed to room service. Right, room service, money. Just order something? Yes, I'd like some bacon and eggs. How'd you like them? What? Eggs. How'd you like them? Fried, boiled, poached? Oh, the eggs. How do I like them? Sorry, scrambled, please. How'd you like the bacon? Crisp? Crisp would be fine. Okay. And Santos? What? Santos. Do you like Santos? I don't know. I don't think so. No, you don't want toast? Look, I feel really bad about this, but I don't know what you don't want toast means. Toast, toast. Why you don't want toast? Oh, bowl, a English muffin with butter. English muffin, I've got it. I understand now. You were saying toast. Fine. An English muffin would be just fine. With butter? No, just put the butter on the side. What? I'm sorry, I meant butter. Please put the butter on the side. Copy? I feel terrible about this, but copy, tea, milk, coffee, yes, coffee, please, and that's all. 1 minute, Giotto, strangle eggs, crisp bacon, English muffin with butter, honey, side, and copy, right? Whatever you say. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome. And thank you very much for your attention. 감사합니다. And I'll be happy to take any comments, questions, criticism. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. And I'm going to switch out here to a gallery view and open the floor for our guests in the room and welcome you. Round of applause and or silent claps and things. What do you all think? What are some questions, wonders, observations on this presentation? Sure, Leonie.
Going back to the session on using technology, especially AI and machine language programs to now evaluate tests like the TOEFL, TOEIC, IELTS, and so on. I think this is particularly relevant, a relevant conversation to have with that as well in mind, that it's no longer just that there is a native speaker mindset in evaluating the student's competency in the language, but there is now a machine component entering into it. And the machine is even narrower in range of what is acceptable than what a human being would be. And I just wonder what your sort of thoughts about that are, especially in view of what you showed us with the multilingual, the polyglot actual values. Carl?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Leonie. So I'd say that here all depends on the training data set that the automated essay scoring systems had been trained on as models. And I'd say that these will still tend to be based on probably actual essays that were scored, at least for as the benchmarks for those that got the highest numbers of points, and that were first scored, of course, by trained raters, and they were probably still typically scored according to those highly proficient norms inside, where highly proficient also meant highly idiomatic, right? So not just using a language that is grammatically correct and not just being aware of writing conventions such as a topic sentence and discourse markers and so on, but also the adequate use of collocations and words from beyond, for instance, the top 2000 most frequent range, right? So that will still use measurements, even though there may be no native speaker scorer there physically involved anymore. The training data were still from the point of view graded from the point of view of what it looks like to an educated native speaker, right? But of course, those tests or most of the high stakes commercial tests today serve as gatekeeping devices, right? And they are to be used for entry to university or similar purposes. So they're a bit different from the needs of many learners who may, for instance, want to work in, let's say, you may be teaching a class of future nurses who may want to work in hospitals, but they will not necessarily want to work in the United States or Australia, but they may go perhaps to Sweden, perhaps to Malaysia, perhaps to some other context, and there use a language that may be either the second language of the country or a foreign language in that country, and where the patients and other nurses and doctors are going to be a whole melting pot of different nationalities and languages, right? So I think that we always need to have in view the purposes of our classroom, right? And what they will have to do at the end of the road. And will they have to take this high stakes exam where we need to pay attention to the items that are going to be graded, you know, all the washback or backwash effect of the exams? Or do I have a little more autonomy and I'm not subjected to such external, quite rigid exam regimes, and then we can actually focus on those skills that are important. So of course, nurses and doctors will have to be fluent in conversation and maybe writing down a patient report form, whereas an academic or a scientist will typically have to be able to read academic papers and maybe produce some, but maybe not so often present at conferences. And then of course their set of skills is going to be a bit different, right? And the skills that the competencies are also, you know, going to shape the sort of puzzle of the 6 skills: reading, writing, listening, reading, interaction, mediation. The sliders will sort of go further on one competence in one learner and slower in another learner. Yeah, but that's definitely an important issue, and with the different conflicting stakeholders coming in and exerting their powers.
All right, I do know we have a couple more questions, and so but it also is right on time as far as the scheduled time. I am okay with staying here for a little bit longer, but I do want to make sure that people feel free to go, or if they want to throw a question into the box and just ask it, and then it will be answered in the recording. But Justin and or Yoko, if you wanted to ask it quickly, feel free to do that. Again, I'm planning to stay here. We're right on time as far as saying the end of the session, but go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, the excellent presentation. And also I just stand in it because your presentation is outstanding. And then I think my question is kind of very stupid, but as my teacher, I thought about, you know, we have to do many things to make students communicatively, and then to think about standard English. And then as you mentioned about, you know, grammar issue, phonology, and lots of issues. And then do you think that the minimal pair practice is effective for second language learner or EFL student?
Mm-hmm.
Or try to more focus on more grammar?
So again, I'd say thank you very much for the question. Arigato gozaimashita. I'd say that it again depends a lot on what the students will want to or need to use the language for once they leave your class, right? So if, let's say, if they will have to read academic papers and then summarize them, or read academic papers in order to write their own dissertation, but the dissertation is going to be in Japanese, but the papers are going to be in English, then that's a different set of skills than if, for instance, they will have to take an oral exam. So I would look from the perspective of what they will have to do at the end of the road, and think sort of backwards from there. But I think that certainly models that are non-native speakers, so for instance, successful Japanese let's say, a scientist, successful Japanese doctors, successful Japanese politicians who are able to communicate in English. And they may, of course, they may sound Japanese and they may not be idiomatic, and then they may make a mistake here and there. They may actually be a better model because they might encourage the students to show, all right, I'm Japanese, they're Japanese, and I can see that they are struggling perhaps a little bit, but they are successful. They are understood, and people appreciate what they are saying, right? This may help encourage the students and show that, all right, even someone proficient may make a mistake, but that mistake isn't going to matter. Because often what happens is that learners are a bit perfectionist and think that every sentence they say must be correct, and that may prevent them from speaking at all because they don't want to speak because they're afraid of making a mistake. And of course, whenever you're learning a foreign language, you will not learn it if you do not make mistakes, because that's the process of language acquisition. So it may actually be an encouraging step. And also, yes, also, for instance, peer work will work fine as well, even if the students themselves do not speak perfect English. That's not going to be as much of a problem because it's just going to give them more encouragement to use the language, and their classmate may be someone safer to talk to than a stranger, right? Because their classmate is their friend.
Thank you.
All right. Carlene, I see you're still around. I'm curious if you have a question and let me make sure, Michael, are you okay to stick around? Or
Yeah, I'm fine to field questions as long as there are any.
No, actually I don't. I just wanted to listen to the discussion on this topic.
Great. There was a couple questions that were listed and left from a few attendees that had to leave because of time. I'll read this question out loud. You said that we should challenge the preconception that native speakers are the owners and the reference points for the language. I agree regarding ownership, but I think that the point about reference points may be more complex. Jenkins recommended that ELF users use inner circle forms as touchstones when intelligibility breaks down. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, so it depends it depends, for instance, on the form. If by an inner circle form you mean an idiom, then that may actually be harder to lead to mutual understanding, because several studies have shown how idioms used by one party will be interpreted literally by the other person, right? So actually being less idiomatic may be an easier way out. And of course, the inner circle norm here would be typically an idiom, right? Rather than, let's say a collocation, rather than stringing together two more common words, because you're not aware that another collocation or another special expression or idiomatic expression exists. Or the same goes for syntactic structures, where a structure that may be more transparent will typically be the one that's easier understood. So I think that judging by research from research findings, if the inner circle form is a common form, then yes. But if it's something that is rare and that may lead to what I think Barbara Seidlhofer called unilateral idiomaticity, so one person using an idiom, the other person being unaware of that idiom, then it's actually going to be detrimental.
So they would not be in the ballpark with that one, right?
Exactly.
Sorry, terrible American joke.
Well, when years back, when I was in a certification committee, language certification committee, and we'd examine students who would be getting their language certificates, I would include idioms that, in order to, catch them sort of unattended. So, for instance, I like the form, let's say someone was talking about some hobby, and I'd say, all right, so what made you choose this in the first place? And then they would go, not in the first place. Actually, the more important thing was, right? So, interpreting this literally. And so the question is, do you want to sound native-like or professional, fluent, and exhibit the norms and show cultural references to another culture that may actually not be maybe understood, for instance, in the US and maybe not in the UK if you use a reference for, say, baseball or American football? Or do you just want to get your message across, right? And then you have to try and figure out how much your interlocutor actually knows. And if your interlocutor is a highly proficient speaker of the language, then by all means use native speaker norms. But if you see that they are struggling, then you might opt for something different.
Good. One of the second question and observation that was made was a thank you. Thanks for running Lee's recommendations through the LFC. And however, there are aspects of the LFC that are problematic in this person's opinion. Jenkins' data was collected rather ad hoc, and she suggested that prosodic, am I saying that correctly? Prosodic aspects were not particularly important, but that doesn't seem to be the case in the most recent research. I wonder whether there could be other more recent filters to run things through. Any thoughts on that?
Yep, so that's definitely a very good and valid point. Jenny Jenkins carried out her study on the basis of speakers of, I think in the vast majority, if not all, European language backgrounds. So then there were other studies carried out looking at speakers of other languages. And in the case of Asia, and the Kirkpatrick is one big name. He collected a sizable corpus of users, of Asian users of English. And then, of course, it will show slight differences, right? So what I showed here was an example of how we can go about, not necessarily, the one and only way, but more as an illustrative point. All right, so we find research and this seems useful. So that's how we can go about it. Also, Lee's list itself may not be without problems. There might be some problems that you may come across in your own classroom that are not on that list. And then there might be some items from that list that you will never witness in your classroom. So definitely.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm sure a couple of our attendees will probably seek you out and follow up with either emails or over in the Discord chat if you're wanting to ask questions and follow up and learn more, say more, ask more. Certainly feel free to do that this evening. And also, actually, Michael, you have a session tomorrow, correct?
Yes, and that's something quite different because that's a research section where we're going to show our findings from a group of over 8,000 participants from 118 countries, teachers and students, and how they dealt with the transition to emergency remote instruction.
So that's a lot. And as I mentioned at the beginning, like in my introduction to you, kudos to you and the other linguists that are watching this video and paying attention to it. I'm more of a practitioner instructor, and I really appreciate how you all are looking at the finer details of the phonetics and just the way that this all comes together and how the languages compare and contrast. I look for little nuggets, pieces of information, takeaways that it starts to really fill my head and make me wonder, like, whoa, this is heavy stuff. So again, thank you for your presentation and for being here at the Korea TESOL International Conference. Is there any closing questions, remarks, things that you would like for us to kind of have as a final parting saying, gift? You seem to have a knack for some languages. Would you consider yourself a polyglot?
Not at this point. I only speak like 3.5 and like a smattering maybe of some others, but not a polyglot, no. Well, so thank you for sharing, James. And yeah, if I were to put my presentation in a nutshell, then I'd say that we, first of all, in teaching, we might want to consider the skills that are more crucial for our learners and those that are less crucial, and divide our attention accordingly. And subsequently, if it's the goal of our students to learn English for communicative purposes, but not necessarily to engage with native speakers or pass off as native speakers, then we might take findings from existing research on English as an international language or English as a lingua franca in order to make choices concerning both selection and gradation of content that we're going to teach, and that is going to be our emphasis in corrections, grading, and feedback. Yeah, so thank you very much once again, 감사합니다, and stay safe and healthy.
Great. And again, watchers and participants here today, thank you very much for your time. Have a great rest of your day, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. On behalf of Korea TESOL, I'm James Rush, and we hope to see you in other sessions. Take care.